2 days to honor the lives of Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee, 3 black men who were lynched in downtown Duluth. And now Governor Tim Walz is in Duluth today. He visited the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial earlier this morning and attended a roundtable with Duluth community leaders to discuss police reform and accountability. And right now, Governor Walz is at Duluth City Hall with Mayor Emily Larson. They're holding a news conference. Let's hear what they have to say.
100 years ago, falsely accused of raping a woman and lynched as a result of that. It's a day that is suspended reality in many ways because it links so clearly right now, so viscerally, to the experience we've had in Minnesota of the last few weeks with the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent realization and unpacking and the broad daylight that has been shown on unrest and racism and systemic institutions that call us and are demanding change. And we are here in many ways as communities to respond to that change. I am joined today by Governor Tim Walz and by Representative Liz Olson, and we are here for a variety of reasons. I want to thank Governor Walz, first of all, for your tremendous participation with the pardon of Max Mason. On Friday, thank you, Governor, for leading with your values, with your heart, with the vision of Minnesota. I want to thank you for the many ways you have reached out to this community countless times in the past months as we have struggled with COVID-19, as we have ourselves demonstrated in protest and demand change in our systems. Governor did take a tour of the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial today. Our Human Rights Officer, Carl Crawford, provided a tour to him and his family. We appreciate your ability to do that and making time for that. Following that, we had a really deeply moving and personal conversation with people who are residents of this community, who identify as people of color. They are Black and or Indigenous and or Latinx. They are members of our community, and they shared their very real experiences of living here. I want to thank the governor for paying attention to those stories, for hearing them, for seeking them. And it was closed to the media. It was not a conversation to be shared publicly, but it is one that will inform deeply decisions that are being made in the future. And I want to thank the governor because I know he heard them with his heart, as I did as well. So with that, I want to introduce the governor. We, of course, have many things happening and coexisting at this busy intersection of democracy all the time. The governor is here to speak on a variety of topics. I've kind of queued up a couple of things that I know that he'll touch on today. And so with that, let's now hear from you, Governor Tim Walz. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Larson. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your friendship over a very long time. We've spent a lot of time up here since I've had the privilege of being governor, and it's always inspiring to me to see a community come together, leading on so many fronts. And Carl, thank you for your leadership. You are well known on many fronts, but today to show the humanity of the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial and what it means to us today. Representative Olson, thank you. Your voice, not just for this community, but for all Minnesotans in the legislature, is one that I value greatly. And thank you all for coming today. It is a solemn day. It's one that I don't think things happen by chance, where things come together and we're aligned. This community has been working to tell this story and in reconciliation for an awful long time. I had the privilege of traveling with my teenage daughter today, and she mentioned how they, being a graduate of Minnesota high school, we're very proud of that, but she didn't hear this story in her classroom at any time. And this is a story of who we are. Without this story, and as I said Friday, without the connection to Mr. Clayton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. McGee, and Max Mason, it's easy then not to see that there's a direct line that descends down for 100 years to George Floyd laying on the streets in 38th and Chicago. And the inability to face systemic issues of racism, of inequalities, of educational attainment gaps, of home ownership gaps, of healthcare gaps, and to be very Minnesotan about it and just not really want to talk about it because it's a painful conversation. I want to be here to say thank you to this community for not going in that direction and having that healing conversation, creating that space down there that after the murder of George Floyd, that space was probably needed more than anything in this city. and that is because of the vision of people who understood that. So I can tell you that Friday's historic hearing on a posthumous pardon of Max Mason was many years in the making, and in fact we set the timing of it for Friday back in December. And since that time, between COVID-19, the murder of George Floyd, the civil unrest, and what we've seen in Minneapolis, and the soul searching that not just us as a state, but as a nation and a world have been doing, happened for a reason. And a lot of that comes back to this point, comes back to the city of Duluth, a great city, one leading on so many fronts, and one that is leading on the idea that before you can have healing and movement forward, you have to have truth and reconciliation. I say that as someone who has also seen this from the pain suffered in the genocide of our indigenous communities, because every December 26th, I would take my daughter down to Reconciliation Park on Riverfront Drive, where 38 Dakota men and boys were executed in the nation's largest mass execution. Those stories inform who we are today. So I am just grateful for the invitation to be here. I am humbled to stand amongst the founders that were down there today, and to hear the stories of everything about how the statues were made, and the looking across that corner to that street post, to starting at the police station, but then to ending upstairs, as the mayor said. A very visceral and painful conversation, one that many times came back to, we need white men to stand up and tell the story. We need to bear witness to what's happening, and a community that's tired of being asked to fix problems that weren't their problem, that were thrust upon them. And I heard that fatigue. I heard the pain in a mother's voice, worried about her 15-year-old. But I heard that sense of promise that we're going to be defined, whether you like it or not, we are going to be defined either by the murder of George Floyd or by how we respond to the murder of George Floyd. And if we choose to respond in a manner that this community decided on the healing that happened down at that memorial, if we choose to make the structural changes necessary, certainly on how we do policing, but how we teach our children, how we value wealth, and the ability to make sure that there is a sense of fairness that goes into how we acquire that. How we cannot accept that Minnesotans are doing right, trying to do everything by COVID-19, but here and across the nation, your chance of getting this virus and your chance of becoming ill or dying by it are much greater if your skin is brown or black. That is simply unacceptable. And the idea that in Minnesota, that I can tell you with great accuracy, the educational attainment level, the wealth level, and how long someone will live. If I walk down to that hospital and there's 2 babies born today and one is white and one is brown or black, I can tell you the difference today with great accuracy because of the structures we put in place. So I'm here to make that commitment along with the legislators in a manner that transcends politics, but gets to the heart of the things that can really bring out the best that we have. So I am really grateful. Liz, would you like to say a few words? I'm really grateful you're here.
Well, thank you to the governor and mayor. Thank you for being here today. It's an important day to be in Duluth and to have you here and for your leadership. And thank you to the mayor and to Carl and for allowing me to be here. And I'll just quickly say that Minnesotans, should be able to come home safely at the end of the day. And for far too long, that has not been the case. And more than that, Minnesotans need to be able to thrive. And I'm actually going to be jumping off to go into our special session where we have the opportunity to work with what the governor said and put forward some bold and transformative legislation. And in the House DFL caucus, we have been led by our people of color and Indigenous members who have the lived experience, the connection to the communities, and the truths, and they're leading in this moment with over 20 pieces of legislation that we're going to be seeing that the governor has supported. We've centered the voices of Black, brown, indigenous people in this moment, and I'm hopeful that we can get something across the finish line that is meaningful and really rises to the moment we're in. So I think Minnesotans are asking that of us, and we need to deliver, and I'm so proud that we have a governor that's willing to call that out and push us to the finish, and we have great partners here at the City of Duluth to do all of that. So thank you for having me here. Yeah.
Please, if you have any questions.
Governor Walz, what was it like when you were there? Like, what went through your mind when you looked at that memorial today?
You know, I mentioned that I was with my wife and daughter today. Several years ago, we went on a pilgrimage by Faith and Politics, the Institute, led by John Lewis, down to Selma and Montgomery and Birmingham, and walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I think every time when you'd go there, that sense of reconciliation and healing, and you could feel the power of the moment. And again, I don't think things happen by chance, that this incredibly important memorial, a story that most Minnesotans don't know, in 2020 they don't know, this community knew it, this community told us. I think it's that sense of you can't help but think of the horror of that night. You can't think of the terror that must have gone through those 3 young men as they were drug out of that jail. But you also, 100 years later, can't miss that this happened for a reason on the heels of the murder of George Floyd. So for me, it possessed the sadness of the failure of what we've done, but the promise of hope, that this is a community that refuses to do the Minnesota thing, Minnesota nice, and just not talk about it. This community insisted that we talk about it. I mentioned the other day, I've become friends, and this is a sad and tragic part of when you have police killings. I've become friends with the mothers who's lost their sons. And one of them is Valerie Castile, and she's the first person who called me when George Floyd was murdered. And she said a statement to the Lieutenant Governor and I, and she said, it felt like God gave you Philando to make a change and you missed it. And it feels like now he gave you George Floyd to miss that. I think the city of Duluth is making sure that those stories are told. So it's very powerful.
And what words do you have for those who may be still living along their bloodline, like their family members? What words do you have for them on this 100th anniversary?
I'm sorry.
So for those in their bloodline, their family members that may be alive today, what words do you have for them on this 100th anniversary?
Well, I know words don't do it. We are deeply sorry for this, the deepest apologies. The same thing we said with Max Mason's family, that the trajectory of their lives, and think about this, the trajectory of those families' lives were forever changed because of that. And I think so many times the only way we can honor that is not with words or not with an I'm sorry, but with the actions to show that what happened. I truly believe that from that street corner down there was a direct line from Mr. Clayton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. McGee, and Mr. Mason directly to George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis. That inability to deal with that led to what happened down there. And if we don't see those connections, then we don't do tribute to their families. So on behalf of the state of Minnesota, we are so deeply sorry, but our commitment now is to fix this in a way that really honors what they so they don't have to see that legacy be one of systemic racism, but one of promise, hope.
Governor, what discussions have you had with Republicans in the Senate about police accountability measures? And can you weigh in on the measures that they've been putting forward, how they compare to what's coming forward in the House?
Yeah, and I could maybe let, I know Representative Olson laughed. I said this upstairs. I was deeply disappointed Friday that we didn't pass some legislation that I think we all agree on. I don't think you'll find one Minnesotan that thinks that chokeholds are okay. Why didn't we make a symbolic, even if it was symbolic, movement on Friday? With that being said, I saw the headline then the next day, both here and in the New York Times, that said that the GOP didn't want this change. Now, I have to be honest with you. Just to go out, I'm angry about that. I'm not happy about it. But to go out there and complain and say, see, they're stopping this, is not good enough. My job has to be to bring them back to the table, to bring everyone back to the table and find some solutions. So I called the other night and I talked to leadership and said that there's possibilities here. There are possibilities that we agree upon. I think they need to listen closely to the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus. These are not new ideas. These are ideas that have been implemented across the country in many cases for decades on changes to policing, changes to some of the arbitration, changes to some of the things that actually show data that works. And so I told them, again, us as a state either devolving into political and partisan sniping about this, or us adjourning on Friday and not doing anything, in my opinion, will set the tone of how this state is viewed for generations. I truly believe that. And I said, I don't claim to have all the answers, and I'm certainly not trying to read into their hearts, because I certainly believe that they have the same sense of revulsion and loss of humanity that happened to George Floyd. But to sit back and not do anything leads back to that direct line back down to this memorial. So I'm hopeful. We had the conversations. I said I am more than willing to work with them. I used the line, and I'll say it here, I am, and I think you've seen me do this, I am willing to compromise, but not on our values and not on the values of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. I am not willing to compromise their values and what they're asking for, but I am more than willing to compromise on legislation that might be holding up some of this movement.
Okay, being a strong advocate for education, you were mentioning about, your daughter said she's never
Yes.
heard of this in school. Like, what would you like to see happen now?
Yeah, the question was about being a teacher and an advocate for this and abject failure. I mentioned down at the memorial, I had the opportunity as a young teacher to be selected to attend the Balfour Fellows of Genocide Studies at the Holocaust Museum. They took one teacher from each state and they took us to the Holocaust Museum, and we spent a week, and then we were a cohort that worked together about teaching about this, because what we'd found out is if you ask American students about the Holocaust, they could tell you that it happened to Jewish people during the Second World War and there were about 6 million people killed. But if you would ask them, why do you think it happened? What led to it? It just monsters in time. It was just an anomaly. That wasn't us. They took us there to change the narrative around how we teach that. I think we have serious and systemic issues of how we teach this. We spend some of our history books have 2 pages of Anishinaabe and Dakota history. How can that be on the very land that we're living on? Those stories aren't told, and the contributions, and start having this conversation about, and again, they're not just paintings or symbols. They mean something to people, and if we're not telling our history the right way, and you're hearing it at the federal level, and I am encouraged by Republican legislators talking about changing the names of places, like I trained at Fort Benning, named after Confederate generals. So my take is, as an educator, we need to think deeply about how we teach these in school. We need to think deeply about having that reconciliation so the story is told. And we need to make sure, and I'm just going to make my plug for this, is students of color do not need teachers who look like me teaching this. They need teachers who look like them teaching it to them. They need to be able to see that. There can be a cultural competency that all of our teachers understand, but until we have some equity in terms of teachers of colors in the classroom, I think we're going to continue to see this gap go on.
Any other questions?
Any final thoughts?
Governor, I've had lots of people tell me over the last several days that they think about the memorial, what happened 100 years ago, what happened with George Floyd, and they say nothing's changed.
Yes.
They say history is repeating itself, and there's a lot of cynicism that anything can change. Do you think this is a moment? Do you think something could actually happen to deal with these issues that haven't been dealt with?
Yeah. Those people don't need me to validate their thoughts, but I agree with them. It appears, again, after the conversation I just had upstairs, it has not changed. It has not changed in terms of people talking about their grandparents worried about the same things that the grandchildren are worrying about. I am hopeful. I've always talked about being an optimist, and one of the reasons I'm most hopeful is because I sometimes think things change only when they absolutely have to change. And I think this is one of those. Again, this is me and my lived experience. I think if this moment passes, the systemic issues of racism will be so much harder to change after this if we don't seize the moment now. And I'm not being naive. I'm not asking them to rush through and pass something within an hour that hasn't been well thought out or thought through. Some of these things are going to take a long time. Changing curriculum in our schools is going to take a while. Changing the health disparities and how we got at a situation where black and brown bodies die sooner than white bodies. that's going to take a little longer. But I don't think if you don't get momentum, you're not going to get there. So I think that cynicism they're feeling may become almost intractable if they don't see something change in the near future. I do worry about that. That's my push. And I would tell all of you, seeing that headline that said, you know, they were not going to let anything pass on police reform, there are those out there that I think, wow, what a political thing. You can just hit on them on that and blame them. I'll tell you what the public is not interested in is finding someone to blame for why things did not happen. And so I said, I'm not going to touch that thing because all that's going to do is make it harder to actually get something done. I want to reel people back in and say, let's do this. And it's not to shame people, and it's not to get an ideology through that I agree with. It's to get things through that people in these communities have been saying will make a difference in their lives for, in many cases, generations. So I remain hopeful. I think my responsibility as governor is to find that ground of bringing people back in. I think the frustrations, the anger, the things that spiraled out of control in some of the rioting, all of those are part of a story, but we can't let it detract from what the narrative here is, that systemic racism is prevalent and has been here. It is causing great pain, and it is holding all of us back from being the type of state that we want to be. And so I hope I can focus them. I can tell you that that Mayor Larson has been an ally in this for a very long time. This city today, and I hope the story that you all tell today is a city that understood this as early as anyone. I'm very proud of my community of Mankato with Reconciliation Park on the 38 Dakota. I'm also very proud of this community because these are two of the most horrific things. Mankato was poison to Indigenous people for so long, but I think if you talk to them today, there's a sense that that community has changed its heart. I think this community's been doing that for a long time, and we have to continue to do better. So I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Everybody. Thank you.
Carl, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much,
Nice to see you.
Safe travel.
Thank you all.
We just heard from Governor Tim Walz speaking outside of Duluth City Hall. He addressed the lynchings of Clayton, Jackson, and McGee 100 years ago today and Friday's posthumous pardon of Max Mason. He said, before you can have healing and moving forward, you have to have truth and reconciliation. And he said it's necessary for Minnesotans to know the story of Clayton, Jackson, and McGee. He said what happened that night in Duluth has a direct line to what happened to George Floyd 3 weeks ago in Minneapolis, and that change is crucial. The governor also referred to a private roundtable with community leaders that took place right before the conference, where stories were shared about racial inequalities and how to make necessary structural changes to combat systemic racism in our communities. Representative Liz Olson and Mayor Emily Larson also spoke at that conference. We'll have much more on all of this on the CBS 3 News at 5, 6, and 10, and of course tomorrow on CBS 3 This Morning. For now, we'll return to your regularly scheduled programming.